poor 1,800 and freeze to death. Some harvests failed for 3 consecutive years. There were food riots. Many people were dying from starvation. It was one of the coldest, darkest periods in modern history. So one answer to the question posed to Mary Shelley seems to be, it wasn't really her. It was the fantastic weather. In her preface, Mary recounts how the weather caused her to be housebound with her companions. The weather, the contest, the dream, all of these factors seem significant in Mary Shelley's response to the question, how could a young girl come up with such a disturbing narrative of Dr. Frankenstein and his monster? But these factors comprise a backdrop, not a foreground, for the more honest response. She was an extremely creative young girl. And that seemed to be outside of the realm of accepted perceptions of young girls. This evening, I'm interested in exploring the response to the question that inspired my title. What happens when women dream of monsters? Oh, I have this slide up because Mary Shelley Frankenstein was first published anonymously. And people will remember Virginia Woolf's quote from A Room of One's Own, that for most of her history, Anonymous was a woman. Mary dreams of both the monster and the one who creates the monster. She dreams of the one who is able to reanimate life through science and alchemy, and she writes it down. For me, as a scholar of literature and cultural studies, Mary Shelley's life and the impact of Frankenstein is rich with possibility. The enduring power of the novel is evident in how many different ways scholars and artists have celebrated Mary Shelley here at Emory and around the country. My goal here is to focus on gender in the novel as a way to explore the social implications of what the novel and Mary Shelley's life continue to teach us about the lived experiences of Mary Shelley's life. Continue to teach us about the lived experience of women grappling with ethical and social questions about gender and creativity. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, issues of gender are explored through the creation of an unnatural monster, placed in an otherwise ideal society with central characters that exemplify idealized gender roles. The creation of Frankenstein's monster poses critical questions about the social makeup of 19th century British society. The unusual nature of the monster's quote-unquote birth, as well as his subsequent experiences and travels, all oppose the significance of female gender roles in British society, and ultimately suggest that instead of serving as companions to men only, women could actually play a more key role in contributing to the stability of the prevailing social order. The presentations of gender in Frankenstein are marked by male characters who seem detached from the domestic matters and in its place possess an obsessive single-mindedness in the pursuit of their goals. The section called the Mary and the Margaret of Monsters. Everyone who reads Frankenstein is essentially asked or required by Mary Shelley to occupy a particular kind of space, and that is the space of the woman to whom the narrative is relayed through the letters to Margaret Saville from her brother. Mary Shelley's first act of highlighting gender in the novel is this. Not only do we read with Saville, it would be impossible to read Frankenstein without her. Within the world of the novel, at least, Margaret Saville is the one who could have published the collection of letters from her brother so that it could end up in our hands. Saville thus becomes the editor of the physical book. Many scholars have noted that the shared initials of Margaret Saville and Mary Shelley, and they often prefer to think of Saville as Shelley's stand-in in the novel. This is kind of an easy reading and one that might have been intended, but I think a more compelling argument for the link between Margaret Saville and Mary Shelley is that Margaret Saville is a witness to the narrative in a way that Mary is a witness to the impressive workings of her own mind. Margaret Saville didn't witness any of the events in the narrative as they unfold, neither did her brother, and in fact, some of the Frankenstein didn't even witness. He conjectures or relays someone else's story. And this reminds us that the story itself is not only a story, it is a printed, edited collection of letters that detail a dictated autobiography written over some unknown amount of time, including the telling and retelling of other people's story. This narrative distancing may reflect Margaret Saville's non-presence, which actually proves to be essential and echoes the themes of marginalized women that appear throughout the novel. In many gendered interpretations of the novel, Victor Frankenstein begins his misappropriation his misappropriation of femininity during the creation scene, demonstrating the ultimate culmination of his attempt to neutralize sexuality and eliminate his need for women by assuming the roles of both mother and father. His moment of discovery is described in itself as a process of pregnancy and childbirth. His research and experiments take 3 seasons, approximately the amount of time for pregnancy. During this time, he describes his behavior as abnormally focused. Quote, after days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, he says, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. With the assistance of science, he is able to bypass nature and attain the goal of masculine childbirth. However, his narcissism ultimately fails him as he rejects the monster he believed was created from passion. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley warns us about the social dangers of an imbalanced system of binary opposition. Because men are consumed with their pursuits and external knowledge they're not taught to nurture, and because women are bound to family and home, they cannot contribute their knowledge to the society. Men and women are segregated, yet also they rely on each other, and such is the case for Victor Frankenstein and his creation. What happens when women dream of monsters? One of the things that happens is a completely new, complex relationship is introduced, a man and his monster. Another thing that happens is the introduction of a genre of literature, science fiction. Mary Shelley is widely credited for the invention of a new literary genre. Many scholars consider her novel Frankenstein to be the first science fiction story. This is what else happens. The author's talent will often be questioned or attributed to a man. Could Mary Shelley, an unpublished 18-year-old, really have written a novel, or was Frankenstein monster really the creation of her future husband, Percy Shelley? So I found this online. This is from a site called Head Scratchers. Here's the question. If Frankenstein was so worried about the monster breeding with the mate that he was building, this is the bride for Frankenstein, why didn't he just leave out the ovaries? Here are 2 answers. The book was written in the 19th century. I doubt the author even knew what ovaries were. And precisely, Frankenstein may have been a scientific genius, but Mary Shelley wasn't. When I studied this novel in graduate school, I remember thinking that Mary Shelley had turned traditional gender doctrine on its head, emphasizing that without women, without the balance that they bring to society, chaos reigns. Through her recuperation of women and their social significance, Mary Shelley strongly echoes the ideology of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who famously advocated for widespread women's education and the vindication of the rights of women. Mary Shelley critiques the marginal contributions of women to the social order in a way that is often considered to be quite progressive. On the other hand, for some scholars, female characters within the novel, Sapphy, Elizabeth, Justine, Margaret, and Agatha, provide nothing more than a channel of action for male characters in the novel. Events and actions happen to them, usually for the sake or teaching of a male character, a lesson sparking an emotion within the male character. Each of Shelley's women, some people have argued, serves a very specific purpose in Frankenstein. One in particular argues that Mary Shelley's women are objectified, they're used, they're abused, and easily discarded. None of them, except for Margaret Seville, survive the novel, and all of them live their functional lives to serve a very specific function and impact a man's life. As a literary scholar, I don't feel compelled to choose one interpretation over the other. My appreciation for Frankenstein is informed by how passionately readers respond to the novel and how this response results in an impressive pollination of other genres that owe a debt to Mary Shelley. For many scholars, Frankenstein is a parable which explores the manifest possibilities and consequences when humanity confronts and breaches the limits of nature. And the limits of nature are breached in Frankenstein, and they are breached in the AMC series The Walking Dead. Right? For those of you who are unfamiliar with The Walking Dead, who's unfamiliar with The Walking Dead? It's okay to admit it if you have other things to do that people don't want to say. It's fine. You've been like reading and writing rather than watching The Walking Dead. It's okay. This is what I'll tell you. The Walking Dead is an American post-apocalyptic horror television series that's based on the science fiction comic book of the same name. Rick Grimes, who's a sheriff, awakens from a coma, discovering a world overrun by zombies. He reunites with his family and becomes the leader of a group he forms with other survivors. Together they struggle to survive and adapt in a post-apocalyptic world filled with walkers, that's what they call the zombies, and the opposing groups of survivors, who are often more dangerous than the Walking Dead. Much of the series takes place in and around Atlanta, Georgia, which is why it's often such a big deal here. And, let me read you this quote. So people have said that it's arguably TV's most relentlessly disturbing and violent drama. This is why many people don't watch it. It's also arguably the most popular. Extreme is the new mainstream. The series poses questions about the human race itself. It reanimates the fears we thought we had buried long ago. What could be more frightening than to discover mankind's worst nightmare turns out not to be aliens or giant insects or monsters, but our own flesh and blood? The grave truth is that the monster is indeed us. The obvious connection between Frankenstein and The Walking Dead is, of course, the reanimation of the body after death and the upending of the sort of so-called natural order of death as the end of life. I'm not interested in the comparison of monsters as much as I'm interested in engaging us in a discussion about the enduring power of a dream that led to a story that changed the world. And that dream and that story happened in the mind of a young girl. The simplistic but accurate cause and effect is that without Frankenstein, there is no science fiction. Go here. Okay. Without Frankenstein, there is no science fiction. And science fiction is the only genre that depicts how society might function differently. This is a first step towards progress, since it allows us to imagine the future that we want and consider ways to work towards it. One of the things we need to ask ourselves is about the role of women and girls in our future. Okay. So here's some things about science fiction. And one is that science fiction has been called the study of the possible. And I chose The Walking Dead particularly, I'll go back to these two slides, because of the emphasis on gender and the way that people review The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead is an incredibly popular series that has very strong female characters. And this is when you go online, they're called the badass women of The Walking Dead. Now, I'm not sure I would want my picture under a title that says the badass women of The Walking Dead, but it made me think about an audience that is really moved by a particular kind of strong female character in science fiction. So here they are, and here they are actually looking sort of more heroic and badass. Imagining the future. Why do we need science fiction? One of the things that science fiction gives us is an intellectual excitement of the what-if scenario. Science fiction can inspire more people to become scientists, hopefully also more girls, and it also offers a space where rationality and creativity come together. Science fiction is a medium providing unique commentary and reflection on social, religious, and ethical issues, and science fiction has been called the study of the possible. And so I want to end with this thought here. Mary Shelley explored the potential negative effects of scientific advancements. Frankenstein's explored the consequences of creating life, and science fiction has been called the study of possibility. When we think about Frankenstein, we must also think about what it means to live in a culture and how we place possibility, creativity, intellectualism, and the way we think about our future side by side. When women dream, anything is possible. Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful. Mary Shelley. I'm going to end there. Thank you. So instead of reading a very long, very theoretical paper with a lot of name dropping, because I am in my heart of hearts a teacher, I wanted to present something that would really engage us in conversation. And so I hope that's what will happen now. And in particular, I'd really like for someone to tell me about some of the other FACE events that they've been to and what they liked about it. I'll call on you. I'm a teacher. Somebody want to say something about something they attended? Go ahead.
Yeah, we went to the Department of Center of Humanities, and
Center for
we
Humanities.
read as a group over the space of a month
Okay,
Frankenstein and did an analysis of it.
okay,
It was really good. There was a group of about a dozen of us. We did that for a month.
and what did you like about it?
Well, I'd never read it before, so I was engrossed in we talked about the sympathies of the different characters, and there was almost a divided room where some people had some sympathy for Victor Frankenstein,
Right,
and the other half of the room had completely negative, no sympathy for Victor Frankenstein,
exactly.
just as a radical egomaniac.
right.
And there was the more sympathetic character in the book that we thought was the monster.
Yes. Yes.
And
Isn't that amazing? Amazing that everyone would read the same book and come up with completely different interpretations.
So that was really good.
Anybody else want to share an event that they went to?
Just to let you know, there really have only been 2 so far.
Okay,
Most of the events are coming up.
okay, following this one, okay. Go ahead.
So one of the event where Ross and the portrait artist unveiled his
Yes.
the portrait that he did
Yes.
at the Schwartz Center. One of the stories that I was disappointed that he left out was that right after the idea was proposed to him to consider doing the portrait, it so happened that 3 days later he was going to curate his own exhibition at the Palace of Nations in Geneva of 16 portraits, and that villa where Lord Byron had the party,
Right,
where Mary Shelley and her then lover Percy attended,
right.
it still exists the way it did then. And it's called Villa Diodora. Is that?
Yes.
And Ross spent an afternoon in and this was 3-4 days after he agreed to do the portrait, and he wanted to walk the grounds of the villa, where she spent actually some time, because it was a while before she was able to, or before the dream overtook her.
Right.
And I just found it so powerful myself that what he was doing to kind of channel her thinking was to be in the space where she actually did have this nightmare that caused it. So it's just a stray comment that I just felt it connected him to Mary Shelley in a way that other things couldn't have. And it was just serendipitous that he happened to have been going to Geneva that week.
Wow, I think Mary Shelley orchestrates those things from the beyond. Go ahead.
I really appreciated your talk, and I was wondering if you thought of ways to connect some of this. Is mostly through the lens of gender, but I was wondering if you were thinking about race at all. And then at the end, when you were talking about science fiction, I was thinking about Octavia Butler. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about this.
You know, I'm not a science fiction aficionado at all, except for probably I read Octavia Butler, I watch The Walking Dead, I also watch Game of Thrones. So that, I guess I just said that I really am. I really am interested in science fiction. So I'm interested in all of those things. I think in terms of race and Frankenstein, a way that I decided not to go in this talk was to talk about the Frankenstein monster as a racialized monster. I think there's a lot of interesting conversation there, but I was really intrigued much more by this notion of who Mary Shelley was, how people thought of her, and I kept coming back to this idea that she had to explain to people where this idea came from. And I think for creative people often ask, what inspired you or where did the idea come from? But I think she was really challenged by this, like, how could you possibly come up with this? And I think the undertone is really, what is wrong with you that you would envision something like this? And in her response, she's doing all of this explaining. And every time I read that preface, I just wanted her to say, I'm a genius. That's how the story came about. I just happen to be really smart and creative. Do you not know who my parents are? Do you not see who I'm traveling with? Are you not aware of how well read I am? It would be, obvious where all that came from. So I was really just struck by this sense of her constantly having to defend her own imagination, right? And I thought, and I don't want to say that doesn't happen to men. I want to say that it happens to young women much more. And that was what really got me very excited about it. Go ahead.
So I may have just missed it. So did she dream about it? Or
Yes, she
or-
did.
So she literally had a dream.
Yes, yes, she literally had a
Nightmare.
dream. Nightmare. That's exactly right. Nightmare. She couldn't shake it. She was so terrified by this nightmare when she woke up, she wanted to write something that would terrify her group the way that she was terrified. So that, to me, it seems fascinating that novel began with a dream or a nightmare that she then put into words. So, the controversy over Percy Shelley's role in the writing, right? There's always this talk about how much he wrote, how much he edited, who really wrote it, was it really her? That, to me, that's the case with any writing. There's always some collaborative something that's going on with writing. I think in many ways it's a way to take credit away from her. And there's a way that focusing on the fact that the dream happened to her. She wrote it down. Whatever else happened, it was her dream. And she says that her dreams are for her alone. That she writes for other people, but her dreams are for her alone. And that I just found so powerful. As I say, I found it really inspiring.
I think it's perhaps an example of what can happen when you share your dreams. Because we all have.
In what way? Tell me how.
Well, I mean, I guess I was just thinking along the lines of like what you said, how it's interesting that she had a dream happened to her specifically, and then she decided that I'll write about this and I'll share it.
Right.
Actually, kind of makes me think a little bit about divine intervention. Of course, I'm here.
So you're obligated to think like that. Yeah.
But it's it's like she was chosen. She had a dream. She was chosen, and me, the average everyday person, or lots of average everyday people walking around, they think that such a thing that would happen to them, right? Would it even be worth sharing?
Yes.
But she decided that it was, right? And she did. And we see the
Yeah, I can believe it. Just thinking about it makes me excited. Are there other thoughts or questions or feedback? Something that you thought about?
I think too that kids talked about a lot that she wrote Frankenstein, but she's actually written more
Yes,
books.
that's right.
So, and I haven't yet read them, but and it's after Percy's passed away, so you can't say Percy wrote all the books.
Exactly. But look at how hard we have to work to prove her
Yeah.
genius. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Right? It's an amazing thing to me. We have to work so hard to say, it really is her gift, it really is her talent. So that's, I think in my appreciation for her, that's just something that I wanted to be able to share with you. I really thought about.
I've really been interested in the sort of way in which gender is complicated in this book.
Yeah.
I mean, she did write a story about a man creating life, being the woman and all that. But her mother died 11 days after giving birth to her. She had 2 miscarriages. It's her fantasy, perhaps,
Right.
that we can give birth without having to go through childbirth, which had been so destructive in her life, to her, to her mother. She always felt guilt about killing her mother.
Yes. Yes.
And that she casts a man in the role of the creator of that life. And yet, to me, I think it's her fantasy to be able to do that in a way that doesn't threaten women's lives. It's a really complicated gender narrative.
I think that you're absolutely right. When I was reading more about Mary Shelley's life, I had certainly the same thought, and I've read the same things. This is a connection to The Walking Dead, is that one of the key female characters, Laura, gives birth and dies in childbirth. And so, in this post-apocalyptic world, the idea that women are still dying in childbirth, even in the zombie apocalypse, right? Even as a result that women die in childbirth, always seems related to Mary Shelley's reality and how many women died in childbirth, but also the idea that her mother died shortly after she was born, and that her own children, I think 3 children, 2 of them didn't live very long, 1 lived for a very short period of time, second one not for very long, but her own experiences with childbirth. I think you're absolutely right. I think this is one of the things that frustrates me about a really simplistic reading of Frankenstein, is this is what happens when men try to have babies, right? You think, well, okay, maybe. Or this is what happens when women are really aware of the connection between birth and death intimately in their own lives and sort of, in their own spheres. Like, to not be able to think of childbirth without thinking about death changes you in a tremendously profound way. So I completely. Let me go back to it.
I just because I work watching Victoria Albert right now. It's okay. So anyway, like when Victoria was queen, but there was a lot of stuff going on scientifically. So I'm not denying her genius in doing this. I'm just saying all kinds of stuff.
Oh, all kinds of things.
Starting. I mean, there was a scientific society and learning. In London, they were working on different types of machines and railroads and things. There was a lot of stuff going on, in the area she was in. And also, just the impact of this and fairy tales and such.
Right.
Right. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that goes into the dream. So, what she did was basically still there's all these other factors that were in the society at the same time.
So it's almost as if you see a funnel above her head with all of these things swirling around.
I just didn't realize how much was going on. And then at that same time, just all the revolutionary stuff.
Yes.
It's a lot of stuff going on. Right. So I could rev up the imagination too.
So I actually haven't read Frankenstein.
Spoiler alert for everything.
Well, right. Familiar with the story. I don't know if I wish I had read it before having attended this, just because I think now I'm definitely going to look through it through a particular lens. And it would have been interesting to see how that might have changed. But one thing I wanted to comment on was I think one of the reasons why science fiction is so compelling for a lot of people, including me, is when it tells a story not about the possibilities for the future, but actually it kind of puts a commentary on what's happening right now. So like, for example, in The Walking Dead, one of the scariest things is actually how humans treat each other rather than them, like you pointed out, or Handmaid's Tale comes to mind, because you can watch that as supposed to be about a dystopian future, and yet things that happen in it seem like things that I experience in my everyday life. So I think, he talks a little bit about the, I don't know if the word's like allegory, like how it references like Frankenstein taking 9 months to complete the creation and that, and just sort of like the constraints of gender roles. And I think it's interesting how much of that was possibly intentional and like a criticism of constraints and gender roles, because that's something that like I think even right now would be a very fiery sort of debate,
Exactly.
So it's very interesting.
Well, this is focusing on this really made me think a lot about any constraints that we put on girls. I mean, it's very easy to talk about the constraints that were put on girls in the 19th century, but it really made me think: are we continuing to put any kind of constraints on young girls? The STEM program, and I don't know enough about it. I don't know as much about it to say whether or not people are really trying to seek some kind of balance to make sure that girls are moving more into science than before. But it made me think about the way we think about girls and what their possibilities are. That's what it really means.
Or just to follow up to that, I think also the way that we limit men, right? So you were saying like Frankenstein didn't have the ability to nurture the monster, right?
Right.
He would like abuse them.
Right, precisely.
Just to follow up on that, I was just hearing, I think it was an NPR report that was talking about a researcher, I think at MIT, who was using Google searches and doing it in an anonymous way, so not knowing who did the Google searches, but just seeing when they put what are things that people put in most commonly. And for if they start a sentence, is my son, it ends up being a genius or gifted. And if it says, is my daughter, it ends up being fat or ugly.
I was going to say pregnant.
And so I thought that was pretty telling about this question of who can be a genius and whether or not there's still a gender disparity in the way parents are typing these things in.
Right.
And it's pretty disappointing, actually.
Yeah, that is. Whenever I hear things like that, I'm disappointed, and I always look for some balance someplace else. But it's a reality. It's absolutely true.
parallels for you being in a university environment in terms of how you teach or how you mentor to maybe inspire? The imagination?
How I teach and mentor based around gender?
Yeah, and how to inspire the students that you get a chance to work
Oh,
with
my goodness.
differently.
Let me give you this example. This semester I have a class that's all female, and then I have a class that's mixed, male and female. And in my class that's all female, they're constantly giving way to each other. Like one will raise their hand and they'll go, no, you go. Oh no, I didn't want to interrupt you. And so there's all of this maneuvering over politeness, right? And and so I'm watching that happen. I think you raised your hand, would you just go ahead? Basically, right? And I think, what is that about? The sense of not wanting to step, and maybe it's, I don't know, Southern hospitality. Maybe it's good home training in some ways. But I watch it in terms of the way there's all this jockeying to make sure that they're not being too forceful or too aggressive or too assertive. In my class of mixed, my male students don't have any problem. They raise their hand, they interrupt other students. They want to get in the conversation, and there's no sense that there's anything wrong with that at all. And so I think one of the things that I notice is trying to make sure that there's a little more balance brought to that, but that continues to surprise me. I coached a soccer team for little girls 100 years ago, and this is what I remember, is that they were constantly apologizing to each other for knocking each other down. The game took 4 hours. This was like, oh, I'm so sorry I knocked you down. Could you come over and say you're sorry? Do you accept your apology? And for the boys to knock each other down and the game is gone. And I thought, this is fascinating. Like, how do I, in terms of like an intervention, get in between this kind of sense that it's a game. It's really okay to knock each other down and all of that. So I'm very, very aware of it. And I think what I'm trying to do is to bring the most balanced approach without being heavy-handed. I think that's always what I'm looking for, the balanced approach. But I do. I absolutely do. I would say in my conversations with students, I don't think that much about it. At Emory, I think the range of ambition goes right across the board. I certainly have female students that are just as ambitious as my male students. Here's the difference is in graduate students. We're graduate students. Here's the difference in graduate students. In my experience, male and female graduate students. Female graduate students come to my office and they immediately say, I know you're really busy. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I know you're really busy, and I hope that you might be able to help me. I get paid to be here. It's part of my job. I love working with graduate students. I've never had a male graduate student come in my office and say, I know you're really busy. I'm so sorry. They come in and say, nice to meet you. This is what I'm looking for, basically. I need help with this. I need help with this. What do you think about this? And it's immediate engagement. There's no sense of apology. There's no, I don't want to impose on you. And so I'm constantly trying to say, you're not imposing. You're here. I'm here. Let's get to it. Right? So that's my message. Don't stop apologizing. Stop apologizing. You really don't. People will tell you when they're busy. I'll tell my students if I'm too busy to work with you. Let me do that. I'll tell you when I'm busy. You don't have to do that. Anybody else?
It's just as a literature observation. I think at the CM House party,
Yes.
there was a doctor there called John Polidori,
Yes.
and he wrote a short story called Vampira, which is considered to be precursor to Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Dracula. Can you imagine at the same party?
Both at the CM House,
Right,
Frankenstein and Dracula.
Right. I read that. I'm aware of that. I think that's unbelievable. When you think about who was in that room, it's really quite astonishing. But you're absolutely right. The idea that both Dracula and Frankenstein would have emerged from bad weather, being stuck in the house, reading some stories and having a competition is astonishing. Doesn't it make you want to get snowed in and have like a contest and see what'll happen? But you're absolutely right.
So, thanks so much for
You're quite welcome.
I want to say, I haven't seen Bride of Frankenstein in a long time. I had the privilege of speaking at a Frankenstein conference in Wisconsin a few months ago, in Wisconsin. And they started it, it was all Frankenstein experts in Frankenstein film, experts in theory.
And they started it and it was just a closed conference. It wasn't an audience. It was just us talking to each other. And they started by showing Bride of Frankenstein. And Bride of Frankenstein starts with Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Polidori in a room talking to each other and coming up with this idea. And then it kind of goes into, and the portrayal of the four of them is so ridiculous that we're showing it at Fernbank. Come and see it.
Yeah.
But hearing all of these experts talk about it afterwards, I wish you could have all been there. I mean, I barely said a word, just listening to them talk about it from their expertise is great. Yes.
Before we break up, I'd like to just mention that Turner Classic Movies is the exclusive corporate sponsor of all of our FACE programs for this year, so we're very grateful to TCM for doing this.
And they're going to have some Frankenstein marathons this year. And when they show them, in between them, they're going to show films of the program we did at the Schwartz Center, and Ross Rawson, our portrait artist, painting his portrait of Frankenstein. So that would be fun. The program that you did at the Humanities Center was run by Steve Kravchik. Steve is one of the speakers in this series. He wrote, there's a book that just came out from two Emory faculty, Sidney Berkowitz and Eddie von Mueller, on Frankenstein, a series of essays, mostly by Emory faculty. Steve Kravchik's essay here is really beautiful. Should look into that if you're interested in getting more of an academic view of this. Come and hear Steve speak. And look at all the other programs, and please join us. You can either take the poster, you can always come to our website for the Center for Ethics, where we have all of our events listed. Thanks to all of you. Thanks, Kimberly.
Thanks for coming.
Have a wonderful time exploring Frankenstein.
Yes, read it again.